Okay, so a fish is an ectotherm, meaning it doesn't require as much energy as an endotherm would because a fish acquires its body temperature from the outside world. However, the cells of a fish, like in its stomach or wherever, can't exchange gases with the outside world, so it still has quite advanced evolutionary adaptations that allow it to exchange gases with the outside world. So let's look at this picture of a fish. I want you to look in the upper left corner here and see the structure of the gill. So we have what's called an operculum, which is the flap on the gill, and then inside of that we have these gill arches, which are these kind of pink structures that we see here. Okay? If we zoom in on one of those, we can see the gill filaments, which are those finger-like structures. Lots of surface area on those, okay? Okay, and they are composed basically of blood vessels running in opposite directions and little flaps of skin that have capillaries, blood vessels in them, okay? So we're going to zoom in on one of those, and that's what we see in the upper right, okay? So we zoom in on a gill, then we zoom in on a gill again, and that's what we see in the upper right picture, okay? Now what I want you to see is those fingers are there. They're composed of these little pieces that have blood vessels in them, and water flows across those gills, in this case, kind of from left to right. That's what the blue lines indicate here. That's the flow of water across the gills. Meanwhile, there is a blood vessel with oxygen poor blood, meaning it's used up its oxygen, running in one direction, and there is a blood vessel with oxygen rich blood running in the opposite direction, and those two blood vessels, those two bigger vessels, are connected through those capillaries, those little blood vessels in between. Okay? So what we see here, first of all, is a massive amount of surface area compared to the volume of those gills. So lots of gas exchange capability here. But we also see this opposite flow of blood vessels and the flow of water moving in this direction. So what we have here is a system known as a counter-current exchange. That's a really important concept for you to learn. Other organisms like geese use this system to keep their feet warm in a cold lake, but in this case we're talking about gas exchange. So it's called a counter-current exchange because if we diagram one of these gill lamellae, lamellae just means kind of like a flap of tissue. So one of these structures here is what we have kind of diagrammed down below. We have water flowing in one direction, okay? And we have blood flowing in the opposite direction through these capillaries. So it's called countercurrent because water flows one way and blood is flowing the other way. Kind of like I-40. One lane is going towards Little Rock, the other lane's going towards Conway. That's, you might think of that as countercurrent. Now, why is this important? Well, what we have here is a system that is set up to set up maximum diffusion. If you remember what diffusion is. Diffusion is transport from of materials from a concentration that's high to low, right? Until equilibrium is reached. Once they are equalized, flow stops. There's going to be no more diffusion, essentially, okay? So notice here, the blood is flowing from oxygen poor blood through this capillary. A capillary is a small blood vessel towards this side. Meanwhile, the water is flowing this way, okay, from left to right. So when the water first encounters this capillary, the units here, by the way, are in pressure, partial pressure of oxygen. It's millimeters of mercury, the same unit we used when we measured pressure in Bio 1 when we used our pressure probes in the catalase experiment. Millimeters of mercury is a unit of pressure. So rather than measuring concentration, we're measuring oxygen pressure in the water, okay? So here we have 150 millimeters of mercury in the water, whereas the blood has 140. So therefore, we diffuse from high to low. Oxygen goes into the blood. That takes some of the pressure out of some of the oxygen out of the water, so now it has 120 millimeters of mercury. Meanwhile, this is blood that just came from this direction. It has 110. So still, we have a diffusion from high to low. Here, then, there's less oxygen. There's 90 in the water, but there's only 80 in the blood. So diffusion takes place all along this gradient because the oxygen is always, or the water is always exposed to blood that has less oxygen than the water does. So diffusion is always taking place in this direction. That is the beauty of the countercurrent exchange. Because blood is going this way and water is going this way, we don't reach equilibrium because flow is constantly going, the diffusion is constantly happening all along the length of this structure. Now, if on the other hand, if we had these two structures flowing in the same direction, let's say we started off at 150 parts per million in the water and 20 in the blood, okay, and they're all flowing in this direction, which would be called concurrent exchange, in the same direction. Then what would happen is eventually we would reach equilibrium and diffusion would stop. Diffusion would stop because we would reach the same concentration on both sides. The water and the blood would have the same concentration and flow would end. There would be no more diffusion taking place. So that is why countercurrent exchange works so well. You're always exposing the water to blood that has less oxygen in it than the water has. So I think the best way for you to actually grasp that, don't just watch that and go, okay, draw it. Make sense of it. Do a drawing like, draw an arrow in this direction, draw an arrow in this direction. You can make them different colors. I'm not going to do that right now. But call this one water, call this one blood, right? And start this one wherever you want. Just put a number over here. Say the blood is at 10 parts per million, and over here the water is at, let's just put it at 100, whatever the unit is. It could be parts per million, it could be pressure, it doesn't matter. I want you to get the concept of countercurrent exchange. And so if this is, let's just assume that when we reach this point, the blood is at 90, right? So diffusion would go in this direction. The water's going this way, so now the water has, the blood has gained oxygen, but the blood that's gained oxygen kept going this way. So the blood back here just left the fish's body. It doesn't have as much oxygen. So down here, let's just say it has 80. That would mean that here, this would be 90, for example, and diffusion is still in that direction. So you can kind of map this out and figure out how this would work. How this is possible by drawing it and working through it logically. And look at the pictures in your book. Watch another video online. Google countercurrent exchange. You can study with all the resources available to you. Okay, so now let's move from fish gills, which has countercurrent flow of water across the surface. By the way, here's a quick question for you. Why does a fish die if you put it on land? It has a really good a system for obtaining oxygen, right? Why would a fish die on land? Well, those gill lamellae, those gill arches, they float in water. When you take a fish out of water, they collapse. So watch my fingers, lots of surface area. When they collapse, you lose all of that surface area to volume ratio. And they start to dry out too. So you need them to be moist to exchange gases, and they collapse, and then you lose all of that surface area when they collapse. All right, so the last part of this video, I just want to mention birds, because birds have lungs. So let's talk about lungs real quick. I'm going to start with birds just because they have the most efficient lungs that we know of. Gills are super efficient structures for obtaining oxygen. They don't work on land. Birds have the most efficient lungs that we know of. So the thing about bird lungs that's really cool is that airflow is in one direction. So you know how we breathe in, we fill our lungs with air, then we breathe out, we get rid of air? Bird lungs don't work that way. So they have tubes called parabronchi. So write that down. Parabronchi. We don't have those. We have alveoli and trachea and all that. Or, you know, we'll get to that. But parabronchi are tubes that flow, you know, in a direction, so air goes through them. Okay. So how does a bird lung work? Well, it's kind of like bagpipes. There's several numbers here to try to make it understandable, but a bird breathes in, okay, and it stores its breath in these air sacs. So when it takes a breath in, that pushes air that was already in this air sac through the lungs. Meanwhile, this air sac fills back up. The air that leaves the lungs goes into this air sac and is also pushed out from those air sacs. There's probably muscles around those air sacs that push on them. So here's the important thing. When a bird breathes in, fresh air goes through the lungs and it fills up those air sacs. When a bird breathes out, this air sac gets pushed on and air still flows through the lungs. So the important thing to note is, even when a bird breathes out during an exhalation, number 2 is when the bird breathes out, this air sac pushes fresh air through the lungs even when there's air leaving the bird's mouth. So there's always fresh, oxygen-rich air flowing through the lungs. Whether a bird breathes in or breathes out, there's always oxygen-rich air moving through the lungs because it stores them in that air sac. So whether the bird's breathing in and getting fresh air into the lungs that way or breathing out, there's always fresh air pushing through those lungs. And that's really important because flying is very metabolically demanding, and you don't want to get a Charlie horse in your wing when you're flying above the ground. You don't want to run out of oxygen and start having pains and cramps when you're above the earth. So that's why bird lungs are so efficient. That's how they're so efficient, is the use of these air sacs to keep fresh air going through the lungs. Regardless if the bird's breathing in or out, there's always fresh oxygen-rich air going through the lungs because they can store it and push it through the lungs when they're exhaling. So I will pick up from there in the next slide. We're going to talk about endotherms and gills one more time, and we're going to go into mammal lungs.